And these two guys together have come up with a plan that's going to possibly revolutionize what needs to have happen in terms of the green bridge to China that we talked of earlier, and also putting a price signal on carbon. We've got to do it. How's it going to be done, guys?
Well, let me, is this working? Let me start and say why we're here and then introduce Bill. Appreciate those few people who are here and the fact that we're standing between you and supper, but we're engaged in a fairly challenging educational opportunity too, because I think it's well recognized that a carbon tax, both a national and international global carbon tax, is probably the only effective long-term policy to deal with climate change. But everything you have heard over the last 8 or 10 years about the political infeasibility of a carbon tax, while correct for most of that time, is no longer true. I got into this because I think now is the time for us to mount a coalition to get a domestic U.S. North American carbon tax enacted. Bill, in his latest stint as an ambassador, really came into this from the international side, recognizing that probably the UNFCCC process is broken, and the only way ultimately we're going to have an effective binding global contract on climate change is through putting a price on carbon through carbon taxes in all the different countries. So I'll let Bill talk a little bit about how he came to this, and then I'll just take a few minutes to say why I think that enactment of a carbon tax in the U.S. in 2017 or 2018 is necessary and feasible, or sooner.
So, thank you all for sticking around, but I can promise you this: of all the sessions you have listened to in the last 4 days, this will be the most important one you can go home with, because we have the answer. It may be a big challenge, but it is the only answer that actually can lead us to the point where we actually stay below the 2 degrees Celsius we want to stay below. As George mentioned, I was serving as our ambassador to Austria the last 4 years, just came home last year. And as a U.S. ambassador abroad, you're constantly defending America's reputation on green issues. We're not perceived as being very forward-thinking on green issues. You sort of heard that perspective even from President Carter about the UNFCCC process. And so I found myself constantly defending it. Therefore, I had to research it and had to understand where we were, what was our negotiating strategy, where was it taking us. And what I learned is that while the U.S. has been actively pushing for a binding agreement, and one of the reasons that we're talking about a binding legal agreement in 2015 in Paris is that the U.S. has been insisting that it has to be something binding, it has to be for real, it can't be mamby-pamby. But the fact is that the process waters it down because of the consensus the UN requires to an agreement that's not going to achieve what we want to achieve, which is to stay below 2 degrees. And Todd Stern, our chief negotiator, has admitted that. That's the best case scenario. We will not stay below 2 degrees with the COP15, no matter what happens in Paris. So the question is, how do we get there? And the answer, of course, is a global uniform price on carbon. And of course, the problem with that becomes, how do you get there? And the United States could lead the way with a global carbon pricing protocol. And we know, or at least we are very confident, that China would join us, that the EU would join us, and you would very quickly get to the point of 60 or 70% of global GDP inside that protocol. All of those countries agreeing to put the same price on carbon, all of them agreeing to a border tax adjustment on any imports, which basically forces everybody else that exports anything into that tent. Everybody would want to get inside that tent and collect the tax themselves rather than pay you at your border, obviously. So how do you get there? The biggest stumbling block, of course, is the U.S. domestic political situation. So we decided, okay, we need an answer that addresses the domestic political realities in the United States. Not the ideal solution, not the solution that all of us would love to see, but a solution that actually delivers a price on carbon here. And the answer, in our mind, is to take advantage of what has changed. There are a few things that have changed in the global community, one of which I saw in Austria. We constantly were finding Austrian companies excited to build manufacturing facilities for the first time in years in the United States. Why? Because we are the cheapest source of energy in the world right now. In the developed world, nobody else can match us when it comes to energy prices. Why? Because of the natural gas boom that's been going on. I did one deal, a $750 million investment in Texas by an Austrian company, a new product they're going to make because of the cheap price of natural gas. They're going to make these high-density iron briquettes. They're going to ship them back to Europe and use them to make steel, and it dramatically lowers the carbon footprint of making steel. It's a product you wouldn't even conceived of before you had inexpensive natural gas and before you had a price on carbon. So, and in their mind, the price on carbon is coming, and they're going to be able to make steel in the United States, that's their plan, with a much lower carbon footprint using this location in Texas in the long run. So you see that happening, and therefore you realize if you put a global price on carbon, who wins in that competitive marketplace? The United States does. We come out ahead competitively. American manufacturing comes out ahead competitively. So this means you have an opportunity now to get the business community on board. Once they realize that there's a plan to make it truly global, you can get the business community behind pricing carbon. And, of course, then the question becomes, how do you get the business community on board? Which is sort of where we ended up.
Let me tell you what the things are that have really changed in the last 6 months. First of all, comprehensive tax reform has very broad support in the U.S., including reducing corporate income tax rate, which is the highest in the developed world and makes U.S. companies very non-competitive. In fact, that's a subject of front-page headlines almost every day now because of U.S. companies going overseas to avoid the U.S. tax rate. President Obama wants to do that. The Republicans want to do that. We are not going to do any comprehensive tax reform in the United States without a carbon tax. Cannot be done. You cannot.
Fee.
What?
Carbon fee.
Carbon fee. We call it a carbon-funded tax cut. Without that revenue, you can't have tax reform in the U.S. And only by using $80 to $100 billion a year of carbon fee income and revenue and devoting some of that to reducing the corporate income tax rate and the rest of it to giving money back to individuals to compensate them for additional energy prices. And you can do both. You can compensate 80 or 85% of people in the country with a $20 or $22 carbon tax. That's the only way we're going to have corporate tax reform. If you want it, you got to have a carbon tax. You're a Republican, you don't like a carbon tax? It's a revenue-neutral carbon tax. No new government spending, not a dime of new government spending. It's a recycling of the money, lower tax rates from a carbon tax. That's the only way this is going to happen. Second thing that's changed is now that EPA's proposed rule for power plants, the so-called 111D rule under the Clean Air Act, is on the table. It's perfectly clear looking down the road that if what we're going to be relying on for most of our emissions reductions in the next 15 years is 111D and the things that follow it, additional regulations under the Clean Air Act, that isn't going to get us. First of all, it's got a 50-50 chance of being upset by litigation. It may not work to have 50 state separate plans. It is certainly going to be 2 or 3 times as costly and complicated and divisive as any other approach, certainly including a carbon tax. And that doesn't look to the environmental community or to industry to be a very attractive 15-year future. Indeed, some of you in this room have undoubtedly heard Lisa McCarthy talk about the fact that when EPA shaped this rule, the White House and the State Department came to EPA and said, look, you've got to write a rule that gives us reductions from power plants that are big enough for us to go to Paris and make a significant commitment about what we're going to do for overall greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. from 2020 to 2030. And she said, go away. I'm not delivering. I can't deliver enough to give us a sound global policy with this rule. I'm here writing a regulation under the Clean Air Act. If I overstretch that, courts are going to kick it out tomorrow. So if you look at the cost, the risks, the uncertainty that both industry and the environmental community face, relying only on the Clean Air Act, which we always considered to be the big threat, that this is such a ridiculous way to go about it that Congress has to pass legislation. Those are brand new things in the political calculus. So we've started an organization called Partnership for Responsible Growth. We're basically going out, not so much to the renewable energy industry yet, but to the energy industry and mainstream energy, to Republicans, to governors, to conservative economists and thought leaders, to try to see if we can't begin to construct a platform that is bipartisan, mainstream, just as corporate support, just as Republican as Democrat, and begin to come back to Congress and say, this is doable and it deserves serious discussion starting next year in 2015, and then looking ahead to the presidential race in 2017 when tax reform may be absolutely an imperative for both parties. And second, the 111D rule will have, when you look ahead, will have proved to be unworkable or will have been struck down.
There is some talk in Washington among Republicans that the best opportunity for tax reform may come in the next 2 years, because the feeling is that President Obama will be a lame duck, and therefore maybe it's like, they think Nixon goes to China, this is his chance to have a legacy to fix the budget problem, and therefore maybe they can make a deal with him. At least that's the proposal that Susan Collins, Senator Collins, a Republican, has recently put on the table. She thinks it's maybe doable. Who knows? But we know that part of the mix, if you're going to reduce tax rates, has got to be putting a carbon fee and putting that revenue on the table. Otherwise, you can't get there. And the way to do that, we think, is to enlist the business community and get the business community on board, because this is a pro-growth approach to solving the problem. You get growth on both sides of the equation. You improve the competitiveness of the United States in the world economy with a uniform global price on carbon. And domestically, of course, what economy in the world is better, as we've seen over the last 4 days, at all the dynamic innovation that will take place once you put a price on carbon. So once we start pricing those externalities into the product, then all the things we've been talking about, all these new technologies, wind energy, renewables, et cetera, become far more competitive and are competing on a level playing field and start to win. And that's how we bend the curve, and that's how we stay below 2 degrees. That's the only way we're going to get there.
And we want to do that with a proposal that we can say to climate deniers, you should be for this. A revenue-neutral carbon tax swap or a carbon-funded tax cut is, since it reduces corporate income tax rate, makes U.S. companies more competitive. It models to be pro-growth, pro-GDP growth, pro-jobs. So it's a tax cut for individuals. So this is a proposal that stands entirely on its own as economically beneficial for the country. You don't think that climate is real? Fine. You should be for this anyway, because it's a good economic program. And if indeed you're wrong about climate change, and in 20 years the costs are going to begin to get astronomical, and this is a free insurance policy against those potential costs. Right or wrong about that, this is a good program.
So check out our website, partnershipforresponsiblegrowth.org, and think about how you can help us. If you know companies that you think might want to partner with us, let us know, put us in touch. We've just started this organization. It's brand new. So, we don't have all the answers, but we do have this much figured out. And thanks for your time. Do we want to take any questions?
Questions? Why not take 1 or 2 questions? Any
we have
questions?
a minute for questions.
We have a minute. Questions? We have a minute or 2 minutes. Anybody got questions? Anybody believes this is really doable?
Back here.
So, we went to a solar conference last spring.
On mic.
So I went to a Colorado COSIA conference this spring, and there was a lot of talk from a lot of corporate things that when Obama got elected, Shell Oil, a lot of these companies were expecting a carbon fee. I agree it's better than tax. No one likes that word. So my question to you is, they were ready to pay it, and they all put their own little price on it back then, anywhere from $20 to $40 a ton. And obviously no legislation or anything has moved forward, so the corporations, at least the big oil and gas companies, are ready to start paying this. So my question to you then, if they were ready to pay it now, what's going to be the roadblock to getting them on board now? And
It is true that most of the major oil companies publicly build a price, a carbon price, into all of their planning. And some of them, Shell does this on its website, over $30 a ton. So, in the oil and gas industry, for example, the major companies vastly prefer a carbon tax to any kind of cap and trade, whether in California or what might come out of 111D. But this is our, I guess you would say, our policy gap. The valley of death is called in the renewable energy industry to get things financed. This is our valley of death. Even though most people in the business community know that this may be coming and that it's predictable and it's the cheapest way to get greenhouse gas reductions. So far, very, very few corporate executives have been willing to stand forward and say, yeah, we'll support the idea that this is a serious thing that needs study and enactment.
And let's face it, there's some pretty heavy
organization.
forces conveyed against it. Well, even though they may say they put it in their planning, that doesn't mean they're gung-ho in favor of it.
Don't
But
forget, Republicans,
once you combine it with corporate tax cuts, I think you can turn
it's
them
a
around.
different animal, yeah. Sorry, over here.
Yeah. I don't know.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Kira Finke, Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. I have a question. Do you think the United States will move if a big player like India doesn't move on a price on carbon? And my other question would be, what sort of price are you thinking of per ton of CO2? What would be a number? Thank you.
Most people say you have to start at a more manageable, a modest number, $15, $20, $25, and then escalate it over time. We're agnostic on that. Our issue is the price needs to be high enough to change behavior eventually. And therefore, the global community needs to set a price that everybody can live with. And a level playing field is not going to hurt anybody economically. It leaves you exactly where you were before. And then escalate it over time and see how behavior changes. And ultimately, that's the goal. It's got to go high enough to change behavior so that people use less carbon. And that's that simple.
He tells us we're finished. Can we do 30 seconds?
Yeah.
One more?
Very quickly, with the carbon fee, how much reduction would you have in carbon emissions? With a carbon fee, what is the reduction of carbon dioxide that you'd have with that fee?
There are 4 organizations that done some fairly extensive modeling. Resources for the Future, Brookings, some people at Stanford, and AEI. And the answer really depends, obviously, in the vary, but it depends a great deal on where you start and where you get to. Most people who modeled this show reductions out to 2030 that are quite a bit better than anything else we could get, with a carbon tax that starts at about $20 and goes up to about $30 or $32 or $33 over 10 years. So 2016 to 2026. But it is sensitive to some extent on obviously what the carbon price is and how fast it escalates.
Obviously, the higher the fee, the more emission reduction you'll see. British Columbia started around, I think it was $10 or $15, and escalated it $5 a year to get it up to 30, and then they saw significant reductions in emissions.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you all.